In 1978, the mob was running rampant in this city. The atmosphere in those days was that the mob was just out of control. It was Dodge City.
In New York City in 1978, the mob consisted of 5 organized crime families. The Gambinos, the Bonanos, the Colombos, the Lucchese's, the Genovese.
These families adhered to strict rules of organization and protocol.
The top of the family is the boss of the family, and then there's an underboss, a consigliere, and then below them are capos, who are significant leaders of the family. Under them, they have maid members who are actually sworn-in members of the family, and below the maid members are what they call associates. People could be associated with a capo or with a maid member of the family and carry out the business of the mafia family.
One of these associates was Jimmy the Gent Burke, a lifelong criminal working out of the Ozone Park neighborhood in Queens.
Jimmy Burke was notorious in law enforcement circles as being an absolute reckless individual.
Because of his Irish heritage, Jimmy could not be a made member of the mob, meaning he couldn't reach its highest levels. But he was still very active.
He was a tough guy's tough guy, and he was an earner. Jimmy Burke brought in money, and that brought the kind of respect from captains and bosses that even legitimate Italian heritage couldn't.
Burke headed a gang, or crew as the mob called it, that was involved in bookmaking, cigarette smuggling, loan sharking, and their most profitable venture, hijacking merchandise from JFK International Airport.
In the case of Kennedy Airport, there were 2 dominant families there. At that time, there were the Gambino family and John Gotti's crew, and the Lucchese crime family and Jimmy Burke's crew, which kind of split the airport with John Gotti.
Truck hijacking was rampant at Kennedy Airport. You know, we used to grab a few loads every week, just about. I mean, it was like taking candy from a baby.
It was almost as if the airport was the mafia's ATM. You know, if you needed easy cash, you would go hijack a couple of trucks at the airport, and it would be a load of TVs or a load of shrimp. You know, it didn't matter. They knew how to move merchandise on the street. Kennedy Airport was an easy mark. You had the unions there. You had a lot of the workforce who were gamblers with gambling debts. So you had a steady stream of inside information. Kennedy Airport was easy pickings for the mob.
And if a hijacking occurred, police could place good bets on where it had been planned.
We believed at the time that most of the planning of any hijacking at Kennedy Airport came out of Robert's Lounge via Jimmy Burke. Robert's Lounge was a famous place not only in the underworld but also in law enforcement. Robert's Lounge was Jimmy Burke's headquarters for years and years.
Jimmy had owned the building. He owned that building and the building next door. We had a club downstairs in the basement. It was a clubhouse and also a drinking bar and restaurant. We used to gamble in the basement. We had a nice club fixed up there. We had bocce courts in the back. It was, you know, a place to hang out. It was very close to JFK Airport. There was a lot of airport employees hung out there. We got a lot of information from those people.
And that connection with airport employees paid off. In fact, it led to the biggest heist in U.S. history.
The robbery of the Lufthansa cargo building was the brainchild of a Lufthansa cargo worker by the name of Peter Grunwald. He was actually a clerical employee at the cargo building, and he realized that large sums of money and significant things of value were passing through the cargo building all the time. He then came up with the idea of how to execute the robbery, but he couldn't find anybody to do it. He went to a bowling buddy of his who also worked at the cargo building, a fellow by the name of Lou Werner.
Werner, deeply in debt from gambling losses, seized on this plan as a way to pay off his bookie.
What Werner did was he double-crossed Peter Grunwald, and he took his plan and he went to a runner for a bookmaker. He knew a person by the name of Frank Mena. Mena, in turn, put Werner together with Martin Krugman, who was a big-time bookmaker.
Krugman took the idea to Henry Hill, a close confidant of Jimmy the Gent.
He says he was going to get us all lucky, you know, for the holidays. I didn't put too much stock in what he had said, but as he continued to, you know, to tell me the story and produce more stuff, it started to shape up.
The plan was to rob Lufthansa Airlines of the cash in their high-value storage area. This money came into the airport from Europe, destined for U.S. banks. Usually the money was held at Lufthansa for a few hours, but occasionally, if it came in after the Brinks trucks had left, it was held until the next business day. Because it was cash from Americans overseas exchanging currency, it was in small bills with non-sequential serial numbers. Jimmy knew that with good inside information, this could be a great score. Two more members of Jimmy's crew, Robert "Frenchie" McMahon and Joe "Buddha" Manriquez, were sent to interview Werner. They were the only contacts from the crew that Werner would ever meet.
Frenchie and Joe Buddha met with Lou Werner and got a full set of plans. Then Jimmy and myself, we started to put together the rest of the crew.
The team that would perform the robbery would include Joe Buddha, Frenchie, Vincent Asaro, Jimmy's son Frankie, Angelo Seppi, and Jimmy's close friend Tommy DeSimone.
Tommy DeSimone was a complete psychopath. He would think nothing of killing anyone at the drop of a hat.
With Tommy and the rest of the gang set, the next step was clearing the robbery with the gang's capo, or captain, Paul Vario, a powerful member of the Lucchese family.
Before Jimmy Burke could carry out the Lufthansa robbery, he would have had to have had approval from Paul Vario. It would have been his responsibility to share a good portion of the proceeds with Vario.
Once approval was given, the final plan was set. Werner would watch Lufthansa's cargo logs for the next large shipment of cash from Europe.
They start mapping out a way to execute the robbery, thinking sometime around Christmas. What happens is their plans get expedited because on a Friday afternoon, there is a big shipment of money coming into the United States from Germany. And it is cash that was spent by probably American tourists and others in foreign countries and had been accumulated and was being shipped to Chase Manhattan Bank here in New York City.
Usually, incoming money was immediately transferred from the airport to the bank via Brinks trucks. On this day, however, a delay in procedures caused the cash to be held in Lufthansa's cargo area for the weekend.
Werner wasn't involved in the delay, but after the Brinks guards left, he discovered the shipment. Werner immediately left work and called up Joe Buddha. Buddha then got in touch with Burke, and the robbery was executed on an expedited basis on Sunday evening.
On December 11th, 1978, at 3 in the morning, masked robbers drove a large black van into the Lufthansa storage facility. After entering, they rounded up the 10 employees who were working the graveyard shift and herded them into the lunchroom. Next, the shift supervisor was escorted at gunpoint down to the high-value storage area.
You had to close the outer door, go into the second room, open that, go into the strong room, bring the money to the second room, close that door, go through a series of combinations on the safe, and then open the outer door. Then we had to load the truck, and made sure everybody stayed quiet in the interim of this.
After less than an hour, the gang pulled away from Lufthansa, loaded down with cash and jewels. The robbery went off without a hitch. The group escaped without detection. Burke had expected perhaps a few $1 million from the heist. What they came back with was over $5 million, plus foreign currency, unset gems, and jewelry.
I don't think anyone had any idea that it was going to be that much money.
This small band of wise guys had pulled off the perfect crime. Little did they know that for most of them, this would be the beginning of the end.
When the story broke, it started crossing the wires early in the morning, and it was billed as an armed robbery at the high-value cargo area at the Lufthansa cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport. And it could have been $500,000, and then it could have been $1 million. And then the figure started to climb, and we started seeing zeros that we hadn't seen in any armed robbery, that hadn't even been talked about since the Brinks job in Boston in the 50s. And pretty much before lunchtime, you knew that this was probably the biggest cash robbery in U.S. history.
Though never confirmed, the take was estimated to be between $5 and $6 million. And as the New York tabloids speculated about possible suspects, the police and FBI knew who was most likely to be behind the crime.
The FBI and the New York City Police Department had a pretty good idea who committed the robbery within 2 or 3 days. In fact, within a day of the robbery, there were 2 crews that were targeted as those responsible for the robbery: the John Gotti crew in Howard Beach and the Jimmy Burke crew in Ozone Park.
Undercover detectives prowled the bars in those 2 areas, looking for information.
Would send detectives out, have a cocktail, go in with a girl, sit down, start talking to certain people, and I would say within 24 hours we had the whole story.
The behavior of the Roberts Lounge gang was suspicious. Though Jimmy had given only a small percentage of the money to his men, they still celebrated in a very public manner.
These guys can go out and spend it immediately, either on broads, on booze, on drugs, on racetracks, on cars. I mean, the mentality of these people, I think collectively they had the IQ of an ashtray. They really couldn't function in the real world.
It was the holiday season. Everybody was drinking, partying, buying all kinds of crazy gifts for their girlfriends, and I mean, it was insane.
These were not the faculty of Harvard. When you think of organized crime, a lot of people hearken back to the images that they know, images from The Godfather, that these are men of honor, that they're fairly sophisticated, somewhat Machiavellian. A lot of these guys were just plain morons.
Despite the crew's reckless spending spree, the task of proving them guilty didn't prove to be easy. Jimmy's reputation as a vicious killer meant people with information would not risk going on the record with any allegations.
Knowing and proving are always 2 different things in law enforcement. Very quickly, everybody knew that this was Jimmy Burke and his crew behind the robbery, but being able to prove that required one of 2 things. You either needed forensic evidence, like Jimmy Burke or Tommy DeSimone or Henry Hill's fingerprints. You needed to recover some of that money during a search at one of their premises, or you needed somebody talking about it. And at the time immediately following the robbery, they didn't have any of those things.
Authorities did, however, catch a break when they recovered the van described by a witness as being used in the heist. Part of the master plan had been for crew member Stephen Stax Edwards to get rid of the van by having it crushed in a mob-controlled junkyard the night of the robbery.
He got drunk and loaded that night. He was supposed to stay straight, take the truck to Jersey, have it put in a masher and crushed. He proceeded to leave it in the city, fingerprints all over it, and go back home and go to sleep.
When word got out to the press that fingerprints had been found, Jimmy Burke knew they had to belong to Stax. The rest of the crew had worn gloves. Burke decided that Stax's connection to the gang had to be eliminated.
Stax was the first one to get whacked. He got whacked a couple of days after the robbery.
Stax lived in the neighborhood, about 120th Street, 114th Avenue. Angelo Seppi and Tommy DeSimone did, in fact, go up to his apartment. Stax was in the middle of eating, and in fact, he was in the middle of eating some form of chicken dinner, and they walked in. Tommy DeSimone shot and killed Stax with a piece of chicken left in his mouth.
Soon after this murder, bookie Marty Krugman, who had brought the robbery to Jimmy, was killed. Burke was beginning to cover his tracks. Surveillance on Jimmy and his crew was stepped up.
There was hundreds of feds and detectives following every single move we made. You know, they just followed us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
These guys knew they were being tailed by the FBI. They knew they were being tailed by the NYPD. There was a running joke at the time that, you know, if you were one of the half-dozen people being looked at heavy in the Lufthansa case, if you went across the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority made like a lot of money that day because there was 8 cars behind you.
Electronic surveillance was also used, but with limited success.
Jimmy Burke was an extremely sophisticated, clever person, and was able to neutralize any attempts that we made at conducting electronic surveillance. We were unable to gain entry to his home. Most of his meetings were taking place at his home. If he met outside of his home, he was meeting in the Roberts Lounge, which was just filled with people, so that it defied electronic surveillance. All you would get was a lot of noise. You wouldn't be able to pick up any particular conversations. We put bugs in cars, but it was in the era of disco, and we got a lot of disco music, we got a lot of engine noise, we got a lot of heaters, we got a lot of people, you know, arguing with their girlfriends.
Though it netted little useful evidence, increased attention did begin to cause problems within the larger structure of the mafia families.
It put tremendous heat on the mob in general. The other families didn't like that. If you looked at the newspaper back then, they were reporting practically in real time. The information coming in from the street, the information coming in from informants. There was a whole lot of information out there, and that made people very uncomfortable.
While law enforcement kept the heat on the mobsters, they also pursued another angle. They began to focus on the suspected inside man on the job, Louis Werner.
The first step in that process was to target Peter Grunwald. We got information from people that Grunwald had actually come up with a plan.
McDonald's office convinced Grunwald to testify against his old friend Werner. That, coupled with testimony from several other people that Werner had bragged to about the crime, gave prosecutors a very strong case. On May 16, 1979, Louis Werner was convicted for his role in the Lufthansa heist. Even with the conviction, however, Werner refused to cooperate with authorities in their pursuit of the Roberts Lounge crew.
Somehow, this guy was under the delusion that his conviction was going to be reversed. It was, in my view, it was a slam dunk, and he was given a bump steer by somebody.
Meanwhile, Burke's murder spree continued.
The night that the jury returned its verdict, Frenchie McMahon and Joe Buda were executed. Their bodies were discovered the next morning in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn.
Besides eliminating potential witnesses, Burke's murderous actions were also motivated by dollars and cents.
You know, the greed overtook him, and he went completely insane, you know, and I guess he had a lot of influence from the other bosses of the family because they figured it was just easier to kill all the other people rather than to give them their filets. Rather than give them $400,000 or $500,000 apiece, it was easier to put a quarter bullet in their head, you know? So he started eliminating everyone at that point.
By the summer of 1979, 6 months after the heist, 8 men associated with the robbery were dead. Louis Werner, the man behind bars, didn't know the names or faces of anyone left alive. And over $5 million in unmarked bills were still missing.
The feds had been knocking on my door 6 o'clock in the morning and, you know, telling me, listen, you're going to be next. We know that they're going to kill you. Every time another body would show up, they'd be knocking on my door, you know, interrogating me.
But throughout the investigation, one of the obstacles in cracking the case had nothing to do with organized crime at all.
The FBI and the NYPD did not get along, particularly at that time. In fact, most local police departments do not get along with the FBI, and ironically, most other federal agencies don't get along with the FBI, because the FBI is very territorial. We say they name streets after them, one way. They want it all, and they give nothing back.
I actually attended meetings with an FBI supervisor and a New York City police lieutenant where they would not speak to one another. They would only look at me, and if they wanted to address one another, they would ask me. They would tell me what they wanted to say to the person who was sitting next to them.
But both sides wanted to solve this high-profile case. In the spring of 1980, they finally got the big break they'd been waiting for.
Henry Hill, who was a very close associate of Jimmy Burke's, was arrested by the Nassau County District Attorney's Office on 6 narcotics cases.
Though he was facing a lifetime in prison, Hill still had to be convinced to turn state's evidence against his crew.
The feds finally convinced me that, I mean, they told me that they heard it on wiretaps that I was going to get whacked. You know, you're a part of an organization all your life. You know, there was many times that, you know, I put my life on the line for those people. They put their life on the line for me. I figured that I was more important to Jimmy and Paulie. It was so hard to believe what was happening at the time for me. You know, that everybody was getting killed, and how ruthless these people really were. I started to realize that it was money, it was the greed that, you know, that was making them do this. And, you know, little by little, the more people that got killed, you know, the more I started to realize that, you know, I just might be one of them eventually.
Because most of the witnesses that could corroborate Hill's leads on Lufthansa had been killed, Prosecutors focused on another strategy to put Lufthansa mastermind Jimmy Burke and his boss Paul Vario behind bars.
The FBI, when they do question you, they make you what they call a queen for a day. And a queen for a day is their terminology that if you're going to roll over or give evidence against somebody, you have to tell us everything you ever did or you were involved in. If you leave one iota out, you will no longer be queen for the day. You will be charged with that one crime.
Henry Hill testified to all of the hundreds of crimes he had committed over the last 30 years. Those crimes often involved Burke and Vario. This was Ed McDonald's chance to nab the elusive mobsters.
It's often called the Al Capone syndrome. If you don't get them on one thing, you get them on something else.
But even with Hill's testimony, there was no guarantee that a jury would believe him.
Henry Hill was an unusual witness, and his performance was very unusual. It was unusual in the sense that he was an easy mark for the cross-examiner. He was utterly despicable, utterly reprehensible. He had no redeeming qualities. The only thing that we had, that he had going for him as a witness, was that we had unmistakable proof that he was closely associated with the people against whom he testified. I was sitting there watching Henry Hill disintegrate on the witness stand, but at the end of the case, we were able to argue that if Henry Hill was so bad, what were they doing hanging out 24 hours a day with this lowlife? And so the more they cross-examined Henry Hill, I think the worse they made it for themselves. So in the long run, Henry Hill was a very effective witness.
Although there was not a conviction for Lufthansa, Hill's testimony did lead to 2 convictions for Jimmy the Gent Burke. One for a basketball point shaving scheme, the other for the murder of a man named Richard Eaton. Capo Paul Vario was also convicted on charges of racketeering. On May 3, 1988, the 75-year-old mob boss died in a Fort Worth prison. Almost 8 years later, on April 13, 1996, Jimmy Burke died behind bars at Wen Correctional Facility in upstate New York. Neither man ever confessed to being part of the Lufthansa heist. With Jimmy Burke's death, one question still remained unanswered. Where did all the money go?
There's a lot of people out there who got money out of this robbery who will never be found. Probably the major benefactor of this robbery was the mafia. The bosses of the mob, they got a large chunk of this money, no question about it.
There was a lot of others involved that never came into suspicion or was ever prosecuted.
Certainly for the mob, it was the perfect crime. And the reason it was the perfect crime was because it involved cash, piles and piles, bags and bags of undocumented, untraceable, not hard to launder, U.S. currency, foreign currency, cash. There's one thing that is the lifeblood, the heart of the mob, the thing that drives its existence, the thing that makes its blood course through its veins, the thing that makes its bosses smile. It's cash. And the Lufthansa robbery was all about cash. Nobody so much as scratched their thumb on a doornail. It was clean, it was quick, it was cash. You don't get more perfect than that.